Hello everyone and welcome on in. So now we're going to be getting into the last video here on the respiratory system where we're going to look at the regulatory mechanisms of breathing. So how does your brain and brainstem work to make it so you keep breathing without having to think about it? Or sometimes you do think about breathing as well. And then we will look also at the physiology of gas transport for how we move oxygen and CO2 through our blood. So there's a process of internal respiration, which is the exchange of gases at the lungs. And then no, that's external respiration. And then there's internal respiration, which is between the capillaries and the tissues. So first up here are the regulatory mechanisms and beginning with the central nervous system. So most of this begins in the pons, which is the little bulge here in the brainstem, and the medulla oblongata right below it. So you have these what are known as respiratory control groups found there. So they're either activating or inhibiting. So either causing an activation for um, this event or so for respiration for and when you're activating or respirating, you're increasing your breathing rate. So this works via these dorsal or ventral respiratory control groups. You don't have to know the intricacies of this, just know that breathing is regulated through your intercostal muscles. And here, so for the dorsal respiratory group, these ones are focused on your regular breathing. So your external intercostals and your diaphragm, those are the ones that you're using right now at rest. If you begin exercising and doing forced inspirations and expirations, that's where you bring in the internal intercostals and any accessory muscles where you're breathing harder. So that's when you recruit your ventral respiratory group here. And so pretty much this is all automatically regulated, but how do you choose to activate whether it's the excitatory one or inhibitory one? How do you choose to speed up breathing or slow down breathing? Well, that deals with a lot of communication that's happening here. Of course, you can force yourself to hyperventilate right now, which I don't recommend. It's not good for you because when you're hyperventilating, you're flushing CO2 out of your system. Um, and you could pass out. Um, and like so sometimes swimmers hyperventilate before they go in because CO2 is a very, very powerful stimulant to make you breathe. So if CO2 levels are increasing, that suggests you're exercising. So if you hyperventilate to get more CO2 out, the idea is that you can hold your breath longer. But it comes with a caveat that you use more oxygen before your brain is told that you need to breathe. So, because you flushed more CO2 out, it takes your brain longer to realize you need to breathe. And so, you could see how that could become dangerous if you're swimming in a pool and you run out of oxygen storage. All right, so here I was just hinting at these, but the chemoreceptors. CO2 is the most powerful one, but also oxygen levels and pH. All of these play a role in regulating the output from these respiratory centers. So here, if oxygen levels are low, that stimulates faster and deeper breathing. If there are high CO2 levels, that suggests that you are exercising a lot, and that's the most potent stimulator, and that increases breathing rate and depth. Usually, this is the only thing involved. When you just decide to hold your breath, your body's working on the inside, releasing CO2. Your CO2 levels start increasing until a chemoreceptor says CO2 levels are too high, and you're forced to breathe. There's nothing you can do about it. Your brainstem will take over. Your hypothalamus will send a signal to your brainstem and say, your cortex is being an idiot. You are breathing. And then pH levels. pH is also a byproduct of CO2 going into the blood, but also you can release H plus ions via other mechanisms, lactic acid fermentation, things like that can also decrease the pH and make it more acidic. So remember, low pH means acidic, and usually that's from CO2, but it can also be from other means. And that also promotes faster breathing to get that CO2 out. And then there's also mechanical factors here, stretch and irritant. So stretch is you reach a point where you don't really ever get to this, where you stretch the lungs so much that your body protects itself from damage and says no more stretch is allowed. Then any irritants, this is what reflexive coughing is. If anything touches that little split in your trachea called your carina, you immediately start coughing. There's automatic reflex. So here, this table is just kind of a summary of ventilation regulation. So you got all your little respiratory control groups right here. And so don't, like I said, don't go into too much headache on these, but these are just part of the medulla oblongata and the hypothalamus, and they're monitoring all of this and controlling that output and setting that initial rhythm. And then here, these are all parts monitoring CO2, oxygen, and pH levels. So the aortic body, carotid body, so monitoring what's leaving the heart, monitoring what's coming up to the brain. Hypothalamus is monitoring emotional state and body temperature. So emotional state, stress can affect breathing rate as well. Think about when you have a fearful interaction. So when someone scares you, you hold your breath. That's activating through what's known as your limbic system then as well, which deals with some of the cortical areas of the brain too. So that controls your voluntary breathing. You can tell yourself to breathe faster. You can tell yourself to hold your breath. Eventually, though, these chemoreceptors will be like, okay, we're taking control here, and you're not in charge anymore. But you do have some cortical control. And then also proprioceptors are listed in this table, not as essential. This is just monitoring your stretch of your joints and muscle movements. And then pulmonary irritant reflexes and then the inflation reflexes, like we just talked, are just protecting the respiratory zone structures and also the stretch from of the lungs from overinflating. So that's just a little summary table. This table is also 22.1 in your book too. All right, now that's how we control breathing. How do we transport the gases? So there's only two gases we're really talking about here. We're talking about oxygen and CO2. And when we talk about this, there's a gas law, Dalton's law of partial pressures. So when we talk about these, usually we say the partial pressure of oxygen, PO2, the partial pressure of CO2. When we say partial pressures, if we take all the gas that's in the atmosphere around us, nitrogen, oxygen, CO2, and whatnot, you add up all the components of all that, you get the total pressure. So here, the partial pressure is just the amount that that particular gas, like oxygen or CO2, makes up. So don't let the terminology confuse you up too much. So when you see this little P, like up here, you see the PCO2 in this table. That's referring to the partial pressure. Now, the P in pH is not referring to that. But oxygen transport in the lungs, you want to load oxygen onto a molecule called hemoglobin. So this is hemoglobin. Hemoglobin is made up of 4 subunits here. That's the globin part. And then it has a heme group in the middle. A heme is a porphyrin ring containing a metal ion called iron, or Fe. So there are 4 irons on each hemoglobin. And each of these hemoglobins can then bind 1 oxygen. So 4 oxygen molecules can load onto 1 hemoglobin. And just some interesting stats for you, there are about 250 million hemoglobin proteins that can pack into 1 red blood cell. That means 250 times 4, 1 red blood cell can carry 4 billion oxygen molecules, which is pretty fascinating. So that's just 1 red blood cell, 1 billion oxygen molecules. And I think that's a cool little stat. So that's how much you can load. And then in the tissues, you need to remove this oxygen. It needs to come out and unload and get to the tissues and be used where it doesn't become it, but by the product of cellular respiration, oxygen being there, tissues are then producing CO2, which we then need to get out. But before we go into CO2, let's look a little bit about oxygen. I know we hate graphs here, but what this is looking at is O2 saturation of hemoglobin percent. So that's looking at, so here, 100% saturation means we have 4 hemoglobins on each, well, 4 oxygens on each hemoglobin. 75% would be 3, 50% 2, 25% 1, and so forth. So that's this part. Here, it's showing the partial pressure in the tissues, and here it's showing in the lungs. And then don't worry about this one as much over here. It's just how much is in the blood. So here, your lungs, you want to, when you breathe in, you want 100 millimeters of mercury pressure. That's the partial pressure of oxygen. And you want the hemoglobin to be fully saturated. So here, fully saturated in the lungs. That's what you want. And then when it gets to the tissues, you remove that oxygen and it goes down to about 75%. That means you only remove about one oxygen molecule. So, 75% here, 25% removed. You only move about one oxygen molecule in your tissues because there's this weird situation with oxygen in this term called affinity. If it's not like four people get into a car, go to the destination, all four people get out. Imagine just one of those people getting out, and then that car goes back to the lungs and adds one more. It's easier to add one more than to add four more at the back of the lung. So affinity is this stickiness. And hemoglobin has a higher stickiness for oxygen when there's still three oxygens bound. If there are no oxygens bound, it's a lot more difficult to load oxygen back at the lungs. I know it's weird, but things are weird. And then also pH plays a role. And the take home message from this is at this lower pH of the blood, there will be a higher amount of CO2 in the blood, most likely. A higher amount of CO2 in the blood usually means those tissues are doing more cellular respiration, which means those tissues are being utilized. You're maybe going for a run and they need more oxygen. Conveniently, at these acidic pHs where the CO2 is higher, this dissociation curve is lower, meaning oxygen can come off hemoglobin much easier. So you can remove more oxygen. So at that 40 level in the tissues now, you can remove 40% of the oxygen that's delivered right there. So a big difference. And that is this effect where oxygen is delivered where more CO2 is being made because it pulls more oxygen off the hemoglobin. Hopefully you understand. I know this is complex a little bit, but it's hard to do this chapter without the complexity of it. So that's oxygen transport, and we hinted a little bit about CO2 there as well. So we need to get CO2 out. If CO2 stays in the blood can slowly become more acidic. Now, our blood buffering system using carbonic acid is very good at reducing fast changes in our blood pH. You don't want it to become too acidic. The thing is, when CO2 combines with water, let me change the color here on this. When CO2 combines with water, it forms this H2CO3, which is carbonic acid. Carbonic acid via an enzyme called, it forms via an enzyme called carbonic anhydrase, then can dissociate into a bicarbonate ion, which is HCO3 minus, and this hydrogen ion, which is H plus. If H plus concentration increases, then you become more acidic. And so this is a buffer because this arrow can also go this way and come back if the area becomes more acidic. If it becomes more basic, the reaction can favor this direction. So it resists these abrupt changes. So there are three ways we can transport CO2 in the blood. It can just dissolve into plasma. Oh, why did I switch to pink? I wanted red. It can dissolve into plasma, which is just the fluid in the blood. It can also bind to hemoglobin, forming something called carbaminohemoglobin, and most of it moves as these bicarbonate ions right here. But CO2 is removed from the tissues, and gases flow down their concentration gradient. So CO2 is at a higher concentration in the tissues because it's being produced, and CO2 is at a lower concentration in the blood, so it automatically wants to be pulled in. Same with oxygen. Oxygen would be at a lower concentration in the tissues and in higher concentration out here, so oxygen will be pulled towards the tissues. All right. So in summary here, these figures do it pretty well. It kind of combines everything we talked about for oxygen and CO2 transport. So first here, we are in the lungs. Here we see an alveolus. We need to remove CO2. So here's that carbonic anhydrase. So these are the different three ways. Here's one way CO2 is dissolved in plasma. Here's the second way over here. It forms those bicarbonate ions. Or the third way, it forms carbaminohemoglobin. So all of those arrows go the other direction. CO2 is flushed out of the system because it's at a lower concentration in the alveolus. It's pulled out, and then you exhale, and it leaves. Great. And now you need to load oxygen back in. Oxygen, some can dissolve into plasma, but not much. Most oxygen binds to hemoglobin here and gets carried as as oxyhemoglobin with an oxygen bound right there. Now, don't worry about this H plus. It can interact with that bicarbonate ion to form carbonic acid. So don't worry about that one too much. But then you go to the tissues, and where now all the arrows are just the other direction. So oxygen here gets pulled out and goes to the tissues. And then here, let's do this in red. Oxygen gets pulled out and goes to the tissues because you have a lower concentration of oxygen in the tissues and a higher concentration of oxygen in the blood plasma and, well, mainly in the red blood cells. CO2 then gets pulled back in via all those processes we just talked about. And then the process just keeps cycling and continuing with every breath you take. And really, really fascinating. Respiratory system is a lot of fun. I know it's complex, and a lot of stuff what we talked about today is quite complex, and I went over a lot of stuff I usually talk about in my full anatomy course because this is just a survey. So just giving you all a general overview of the respiratory system, how it's controlled, and little things like that. But I hope you enjoyed this system. If you have any questions, like always, please reach out and let me know. All right, see you all next time. Bye-bye.